Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. We're back in Scalia's Dissent in Morrison versus Olson. Bringing up my screen, you can get there on Giggle Scholar, and you're right there, 487 at the U.S. reports at page 654. Of course, the dissent, we're on page 723, so we're going to scroll down to 723. How do you know where 723 is? You got to look. It's right there. Here's 680. See that? Okay, keep going. 723. That's what we're looking for. There's 710. We're looking for Roman numeral 4 in Scalia's dissent, Morrison versus Olson. And here we are. I will not discuss at any length why the restrictions upon the removal of the independent counsel also violate our established precedent dealing with that specific subject. For most of it, I simply refer the reader to the scholarly opinion of Judge Silberman for the Court of Appeals below. Well, that would be, I can't help but saying this, but a TRP guest here on this podcast, the Republican Professor podcast, was John Yoo. John Yoo, lovely man. He clerked for Judge Silberman. He also clerked for Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. And of course, Judge Silberman wrote the lower court decision in that case. Here, Scalia continued, I cannot avoid commenting, however, about the essence of what the court has done to our removal jurisprudence today. Now, remember, he's writing in dissent in Morrison versus Olson, and he won the day on the executive theory of the president. I mean, the Unitary Executive. He says there is, of course, no provision in the Constitution stating who may remove executive officers except the provisions for removal by impeachment. Before the present decision, it was established, however, that the president's power to remove principal officers who exercise purely executive powers could not be restricted. See Myers versus U.S. 1926. That's a great one to do on this podcast, written by Chief Justice Taft, the only Chief Justice, the only member of the only Chief Justice that we had that was a chief executive as well. He was president. And two, that his power to remove inferior officers who exercise purely executive powers and whose appointment in Congress had removed from the usual procedure of presidential appointment with Senate consent could be restricted at least where the appointment had been made by an officer of the executive branch. All right. We're now on page 724. How do I know that? Well, we're on Firefox, and Firefox likes to hide the page numbers right there in the in a light gray. It's kind of annoying. But if you print this out on a PDF, I think the page numbers go on the side. And so they're nice. Chrome puts it on the side to begin with. I should just use Chrome, I guess. I guess it depends on what kind of mood I'm in. The court, continues Scalia, could have resolved the removal power issue in this case simply by relying upon its erroneous conclusion that the independent counsel was an inferior officer. And then extending our holding that the removal of inferior officers appointed by the executive can be restricted to a new holding that even the removal of inferior officers appointed by the courts can be, now turn the page here, restricted. That would, in my view, be a considerable and unjustified extension, given the executive full discretion in neither the selection nor the removal of a purely executive officer. The course the court has chosen, however, is even worse. Since our 1935 decision in Humphrey's Executor, which was considered by many at the time the product of an activist anti-New Deal court bent on reducing the power of President Franklin Roosevelt, it has been established that the line of permissible restriction upon removal of principal officers lies at the point at which the powers exercised by those officers are no longer purely executive. I know you probably have not read Humphrey's Executor. Maybe you have. Have we talked about that on this podcast? We did mention it in a TRP podcast episode very recently. I think it was last week. Is there a uni party in DC? Check that episode out for mentioning Humphrey's Executor. I think you'll be very interested. That case features in my answer to the question of whether there's a uni party in Washington, D.C. Let's keep going. Scalia continued. Thus, removal restrictions have been generally regarded as lawful for so-called independent regulatory agencies. We're on page 725 now of the U.S. reports. The 487th volume of the U.S. reports. Such as what? Such as the Federal Trade Commission, Interstate Commerce Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which engage substantially in what has been called the quasi-legislative activity of a rulemaking, and for members of Article I courts, such as the Court of Military Appeals, who engage in quasi-judicial function of adjudication. It has often been observed, correctly in my view, that the line between purely executive functions and quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial functions is not a clear one or even a rational one. Ooh. Tell us what you really think there, Scalia. Yes, I agree with him. Now he's walking a fine line here because this is Supreme Court precedent. So, I mean, he's not exactly coming out swinging on this precedent. It's there. It's not good. See, is there a uniparty in DC published last week, April 2025, or was it May? Maybe May 2025. But that's actually pretty scalding what he just said. It's not a rational one. Yeah, I agree. Seriously, how can you disagree with that? Anyway, but there's only one T, don't get excited. But at least it permitted the identification of certain officers and certain agencies whose functions were entirely within the control of the president. Fair point. What are we talking about here? I mean, are you lost here? Are you lost? Don't be lost. It's not that hard. It's not that complicated. We're talking about who's in charge of the executive branch. Scalia is saying it's the president. Hello? Look at your Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, the vesting clause. It's kind of like in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created. There's no ambiguity here as far as where the world began. In the beginning, God. Well, in the Constitution, there's just as clear language about who's in charge of the executive branch. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America, period. It's one person. Incidentally, let me just plug this book here, The Creation of the Presidency, 1775 to 1789, by Charles C. Thatch, Jr. This is published by Liberty Fund. It is fantastic. I had to read this in graduate school for my PhD. It's fantastic. It's a great study in constitutional history about these features of the presidency that we just take for granted, but a lot of them are maybe we don't take for granted because we're not taught well in school, or maybe we are taught well, like I teach well, but the students aren't listening because they have no attention span, and the parents are allowing their students not to have attention span. Why? Because they give them phones and they make them get vaccines, like 85 million vaccines that have, uh, whatever they have in them. You know, it, it's it's a problem as far as I just know that there's an attention span issue that we have in our culture, and it didn't seem to be there when I was a kid. Um, I know that people passed notes and stuff in school. They would doodle and, space out and stuff. That stuff is as old as time. But the baseline, though, was not like a hyperstimulation, dopamine addiction kind of thing you got going on. And whatever else you got going on, that probably Robert Kennedy is trying to get to the bottom of. See our TRP episode called What to Make of Robert Kennedy Jr. That was in 2023. We were all over that issue in the Republican Professor podcast. Great. I'll probably get censored now by YouTube because I said something very innocuous and yet true. Let's continue. Yes. Oh, yes. Democrats love to censor. They love censorship. All right. Where'd we leave off? But at least, yeah. Congress had to be aware of that restriction in its legislation. Today, however, Humphrey's executor is swept into the dustbin of repudiated constitutional principles. Quote, our present considered view, the court says, is that the determination of whether the Constitution allows Congress to impose a good cause type restriction on the president's power to remove an officer cannot be made to turn on whether or not that official is classified as purely executive. What Humphrey's executor and presumably Myers really means, we are now told, is not that there are any rigid categories of those officials who may or may not be removed at will by the president, but simply that Congress cannot interfere with the president's exercise of the executive power and his constitutionally appointed duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. One can hardly grieve for the shoddy treatment given today to Humphrey's executor. This is an interesting line of argument here. He's defending a precedent that he just called irrational. Okay? That's what he's doing. After all, according to the same indignity, with much less justification, to Chief Justice Taft's opinion 10 years earlier in Myers versus United States, gutting in 6 quick pages devoid of textual or historic precedent for the novel principle it set forth, a carefully researched and reasoned 70-page opinion. It is, in fact, comforting to witness the reality that he who lives by the ipse dixit dies by the ipse dixit. But one must grieve for the Constitution. Amen, brother. Amen. Preach it. One must grieve for the Constitution. That's worth highlighting. One must grieve for the Constitution. Let's bow our heads and grieve right now. I agree with this. One must grieve for the Constitution. And we're grieving for ourselves today, too, because we're our own worst enemies on this. Let's continue. Humphrey's executor at least had the decency formally to observe the constitutional principle that the president had to be the repository of all executive power, which, as Myers carefully explained, necessarily means that he must be able to discharge those who do not perform executive functions according to his liking. As we noted in Boucher, once an officer is appointed, it is only the authority that can remove him, not the authority that appointed him, that he must fear, and in the performance of his functions, obey. By contrast, our present considered view is simply that any executive officer's removal can be restricted so long as the president remains able to accomplish his constitutional role. Wow. Jeez. There are now no lines. This is what Scalia says. There are now no lines. If the removal of a prosecutor, the virtual embodiment of the power to take care the laws be faithfully executed, which is the power of the president, can be restricted, what officer's removal cannot? This is a reductio ad absurdum form of argument. You see this? If removal of a prosecutor, the virtual embodiment of the purely executive power here, take care of the laws be faithfully executed, can be restricted. If the removal of that person can be restricted, what officer's removal cannot be restricted? In other words, the power to remove is the power to control. Whoever is in control of the executive branch has the executive power. That person has to be the same person in constitutional government as the one that the Constitution gives the executive power to. That would be the president. This is basic separation of powers theory, people. Basic. It's not that hard. This is an open invitation for Congress to experiment. What about a special assistant secretary of state? With responsibility for one very narrow area of foreign policy, who would not only have to be confirmed by the Senate, but also could be removed only pursuant to a certain carefully designed restrictions. This is a reductio ad absurdum, in case you didn't know that. Could this possibly render the president unable to accomplish his constitutional role? Or a special assistant secretary of defense for procurement? Oh man, that has an eerie tone given all the stuff that Elon Musk and gang have found. That's eerie. Wow. Yeah. Wow. The possibilities are endless. And the court does not understand what the separation of powers, what ambition counteracting ambition, Federalist 51, Madison, is all about, if it does not expect Congress to try them. As far as I can discern from the court's opinion, it is now, page 727, open season upon the president's removal power for all executive officers, with not even the superficially principled restriction of Humphrey's executor as cover. The court essentially, this is sizzling, man. The court essentially says to the president, trust us. We will make sure that you are able to accomplish your constitutional role. I think the Constitution gives the president and the people more protection than that. He's writing this, and this is published in 1988. This is a key thing in Trump's second term, he's doubling down on this that Scalia was right in 1988. Scalia was right. Next time, we're going to get to Roman numeral 5 in Scalia's Dissent in Morrison versus Olson. That's 487th volume of the U.S. Reports, starting at page 654 for the majority opinion. Of course, he's writing in dissent. We are on page 727. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. Today is 8 May 2025. It's a Thursday. We're still in the Easter season. It's 2025 years after Jesus. We'll see you next time.